And hello, we're back for another episode of Declassify. Thank you to everyone who's been tuning in so far. We've got another great guest in store for you today. Once again, it might be another familiar voice to many of you. I'm very glad to introduce the polymath that is Julian Day. Julian is a composer, artist, broadcaster and writer who has worked extensively for ABC Classic FM and is currently living and studying in New York. I don't think I'll be able to give him much justice in just this little intro, as soon you'll hear from him. So welcome, Julian. Thank you so much for being on this episode of the podcast.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to chat with you.
Well, in light of my probably underwhelming introduction of you, I thought a really good place to start would be for our audience to get to know you a little better, for some of them who don't already know your practice, to talk about your experience in the classical world and where you've branched out to since then.
Yeah, so my experience in the classical music world goes back a couple of decades now. I studied contemporary classical composition and piano at the Queensland Conservatorium, and subsequent to that, well, I should just quickly say that I was involved in a couple of composer initiatives at that time, including a 7-year composer collective called Compost, and we decided to try to put matters into our own hands as composers, because we figured that composers are kind of at the bottom of the power chain in terms of, like, you don't want to wait around on the phone for a gig that never comes. So we actually put into place several dozen events over 7 years, so that was really foundational. After that, I went into classical music broadcasting and have spent many years associated with ABC Radio, and for quite some time was presenting and programming major new music programs particularly, but also mainstream classical shows. And that brought me into contact with a lot of orchestras, chamber music organizations, individual musicians, got to know a lot of what the music activity is in Australia in any given year or so. And more recently, I guess, after feeling like I had done as much support as I could of my peers and getting the creative itch back myself, really decided to start making my own work a bit more central again. And so I've recently, in the last few years, moved to the States. I'm living in New York, where I'm pursuing some graduate studies and just trying to make a career for myself, not only as a composer, but also as an artist who is driven and informed by his classical and experimental music past. So I make a lot of work that would broadly be described as just art, but involves the lessons I've learned from those other things. So some of it is sculptural, some of it is video, a lot of it is performance, and tries to get to the nut of what it means to be in social formation with other people. So I think that's kind of ticking off most of the things off the list.
God, you've really covered so many things so quickly. And also in your practice, I actually listened to you a lot. I don't know if I ever told you this when I was growing up in high school. You were still on the radio during that time. And then I eventually met you in the art world, maybe I think my second year at the con. I think that's when I finally met you.
I always feel both good and bad whenever I hear that, because some other people have said that even here in New York. Because on the one hand, I think, oh, that's so amazing and wonderful and lovely that you listen to me, and then it also immediately dates me. And I think, oh God, if people I'm hanging out with listen to me in high school, gosh, I really am over the hill. But I'm delighted. Thank you for listening.
Well, you're always very youthful, so we would never be able to tell, so don't worry about us dating. Well, as for, you mentioned earlier having an awareness of how the composer sits in terms of the hierarchy. Did your experience working with orchestras or understanding how the orchestral programming world functions when you're working at the ABC kind of reinforce that and thus informs your work now more into a sound art or visual art lens?
I think so. I mean, the blueprint of how I feel about orchestras was set, I guess, during my compositional training. But I think all of us who are involved in classical music, but particularly if you're a composer, I think, you're trained almost without question to think of the orchestra as being at the top of the cultural mountain. It's the inspirational embodiment of Western art music ideals, this large flank of people who work collectively and together and make very inspiring, unified sounds. That is fine as a consumer of music. It's amazing to go and listen to an orchestra or to listen to a recording or whatever it is. But as a composer, you're in a very powerless situation because you're trained to aspire to it, but there's almost a statistically insignificant chance of actually getting to write for one. Of all of our orchestras in Australia, there's only one or two that actually open the door to composers in forms of training programs, and one of them's got an age limit anyway. So bad luck if you're over 30 or 35. But in general, like there's no real need for composers in the orchestral world. The repertoire is all sewn up. It's all public domain material that has been, decided upon a good century before any of us were born. And they don't really need any new music. In fact, it's antithetical to the business model. So I guess I just always assume that here I am training for something that I'm almost never going to be able to partake in. Now, of course, over time working in radio, that shifted a little bit because I came into close contact with orchestras. And a lot of my friends are in orchestras. Some of the musicians I studied with at the conservatorium have gone on to have prominent positions in orchestras. I have nothing against orchestral musicians. They're amazing people. And I got to, understand, through hanging out in green rooms or chatting backstage or just getting to know their repertoire really well, to build a huge fondness for what they do. But always from this sense of like, there's nothing any of us can really do who aren't in one of these things. And remember, that's a tiny, tiny slice of the musician world, let alone the general populace. There's nothing that we can do that actually actively participates in that. And so it just gave me a sort of a foundational way of thinking that if I'm going to be an artist trying to make their own way in the world and to try to sort of, treat the social practice of music with any great seriousness, I might have to start thinking outside the orchestral paradigm exclusively.
Did that lead you into compositionally working with smaller groups like chamber groups, mixed ensemble groups, and soloists?
I think initially, and to try to be self-sufficient as much as possible. So over the past decade or so, I have amassed quite a bank of synthesizers, and I've made recordings and performances around Australia and around the world as a solo synthesizer / organ player. So if all comes to worst, I can just dust off some synths, go buy some C batteries and play music myself. And I think there's a long history of composers, probably increasingly over time, forming your own connections and forming close-knit relationships with musicians, and that basically becomes your professional network. But over time, I think what's become really important to me is rethinking music not as the product, like not as the piece or the recording or the concert, but really what are the social dynamics and the social interplay that's happening when people come together to either listen or make sound or make music together. And so that really drives my way of thinking. And there's only so many relationships between a soloist and a listener. It's kind of like one-way flow, really. It starts to get very interesting and meaningful and kind of, starting to think about and configure your relationship to other people in a broader sense when you think on a slightly larger scale. So I guess I've really tried to think about the ensemble as a kind of a conceptual and practical laboratory for thinking about social relations, which starts to make you think a bit more outside of the soloist model.
So when you use the word ensemble, do you mean not just in a musical sense, but making art in terms of the process being accessible with the community that's going to perform it and the community that's going to be able to access it?
I guess so. I think that's one thing that radio taught me, actually, which is that, the act of making radio is the act of putting yourself in the listener's ears, the listener's shoes. Everything you do, it's a lot of sleight of hand, and after a while you can start to be a bit cynical about the theatre of radio, but the benefit of it is you're always thinking about, well, what am I doing that's going to sound a certain way for the listener? What am I doing that's going to make their life a little bit better, or it's going to aid in their appreciation of music or an idea? It's always that empathetic positionality. It's not about me, it's about what I'm doing that then hits a listener. And so that's really driven my artistic practice too. I think it's meaningless for me to sit in my studio for 12 hours a day and just come up with sculptures that please me alone. It's not really about pleasing another person, but it's about the engagement and interaction and building hopefully a complex and generative relationship with another person. So I guess that's one way of thinking about it. And then also making it so that there are a lot of ways in which all the people in the chain can have a certain amount of agency. So if I'm making an artwork that involves an ensemble, so to speak, and for me an ensemble is a pretty loose word. It can mean the people who come along to experience an artwork. It can be the people who also actively make it. I want to make sure that there is a lot of agency for all of the people, so that I'm making decisions and I'm doing something as an artist, but then the people who are listening it can make their own choices. The people who are also co-building it with me can make the choices. And also the idea of the ensemble being a kind of, as I mentioned before, a laboratory. So it's kind of like a framework for thinking about social dynamics. I mean, if you have an electro duo, that's a certain kind of social dynamic. If you have a string quartet, that's a kind of social dynamic. If you have an orchestra, that's a social dynamic. And the dynamic itself and the possibilities are what really drives me as an artist.
I see. So if we're thinking about social dynamics in a working context, do you think that there's a difference in working in the visual art realm than there is in the classical music realm? Just thinking about my own experience when I've worked in the visual art world, having now started to do in some sense what you've done and started to disengage primarily with composition and begin to move into sound art, I found that doing projects in that world that there is a lot more communication between everyone who's involved in a collaborative project at every single level. And say when I've written music for something like an orchestra, say for example MSO, there was very little engagement that you get with the actual musicians, and there's always a mediator. So you have the orchestral librarian or an admin person, so you don't actually, in terms of making the art that you see on stage, actually work with them. You have 1 or 2 rehearsals and then it all kind of happens in a day or two.
Yeah, those mediators that you get in classical music in particular were one of the reasons why I started a project like Supercritical Mass with my good colleague Janet McKay, to try to actually reduce some of those layers that prevent you, the artist, from engaging with the end product. Because I think, the traditional model of being an orchestral composer, it's very, very detached from what the ultimate sounding result is for the listener. On the positive side, you put a huge amount of time into research. So the orchestral composer really has to spend years, if not decades, learning all of the nuts and bolts of the orchestra. You've got to know what note a flute can't play. You've got to know what playing those chords with those instruments is going to sound like, because you don't really get a lot of practice space. You spend a lot of time writing alone in your studio, at your laptop. You'll put it down into a score, and then the score goes off into the ether, and then at a certain point you get invited into a rehearsal, and hopefully to a premiere, and maybe if you're super lucky, a repeat performance at some point. But there's a great sense of hierarchy and distance because there's so many steps between you and the work. So I'm very interested in reducing those steps, and I think you're right that in the contemporary art world there is maybe a few less steps, but we shouldn't be too rosy-eyed about that because it really depends on what you're doing in the contemporary art world. I thought, being a musician, that there were too many limitations and that I would look towards the museum, the gallery, the biennale, the art fair as an example of, anything goes. You realize very quickly, though, that there are some fundamental differences just in history and general purpose in the performing arts versus the visual arts. Because whilst a biennale or a museum might look like a circus from the outside, there's a lot of performance going on, there's a lot of social practice, there's sculpture, there's video, there's all sorts of things. Really, they are kind of collecting institutions that really work best when displaying an object of some kind. Just as with music, you do get objects, you get scores, you get records, etc., you get concert halls, but really it's about the action and the dynamism of doing. I think the sort of the midway space, I suppose, is participatory art, social practice, where the very nuts and bolts of what you do are actually engaging with people. And so a big part of my thinking about myself as a musician moving into contemporary art is to really think of music as part of that conversation about social practice, about participation. And it's about what people do together in relationship to other people. That is what actually sits at the heart of the work.
And you've really brought that together with Supercritical Mass, because you are creating a huge work that is entirely performance-based, but it's inside spaces like galleries or like museums or like more public spaces than, say, a concert hall.
Yeah, I have a lot of problems with concert halls. They're amazing acoustically. I mean, was it the Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg, which is, this incredible world-beating space. Melbourne Recital Centre is an amazing acoustic space. I noticed when I was doing a lot of synth work in galleries that as soon as I got a gig to play at the Sydney Conservatorium in one of their small recital spaces, actually, it wasn't even one of the bigger ones, I suddenly went, I know why you play music in these spaces. They sound so good. But part of the reason they sound so good is that they're really tailored towards the listener. The listener kind of being at the center of the experience, because all of the sound baffling and the shape of the space is oriented towards the listener. So you sit in row F or whatever and it sounds great. But it's at the expense of any freedom of the listener. You have to sit in row F to get that effect. You can't just wander around like you can in a gallery or in a park or in a public space. So, concert halls are great for that purpose of sounding really good, but I'm much more interested in spaces that are actually specifically designed for more rhizomic relationships, for gathering and congregating and having a sort of a sense of relationships being in flux. And that's why I'm really drawn to town halls or to town squares, parks, any place where there's a greater porosity of what you can actually do. I really like these spaces, I guess I call them civic spaces, where there's a multiplicity of what you are allowed to do. Like if you're in a park, surely there are certain rules of what you're not meant to do. There are still some social contract rules and some legal rules that are just going to harm other people if you do them. But there's a great broad multiplicity beyond that. You can kind of have a sleep if you can get away with it. You can read a newspaper, you can play a game, you can chat with friends, you can just walk through, you can sit and listen, you can organize concerts. They're very sort of dynamic in that sense, and they're specifically designed for multiple groups of people and multiple individuals to do lots of different things collectively. Concert halls are really designed for one thing, which is for a certain hierarchy of musicians to get on a platform and tell you what they think as musicians, and for you to sort of sit and experience it. But I want to unlock that sense of freedom and agency and talking back and communicating as a two-way flow at the very least. And that's why I tend to go more towards these other kinds of public spaces.
Well, it's much more accessible for a much wider audience, because there's something ritualistic kind of associated with going to a classical music concert that's in a concert hall. Actually, see if I can find it. I'll pull it up. I think the Sydney Symphony Orchestra has on their website what to do if you're new to a concert. Let's see. They list things like, will I recognize any of the music? What should I wear? When do I clap? When do I arrive? And there's just like a list of all these protocols that you kind of need to know to feel accepted by the rest of the audience that is also there in the concert hall.
I mean, those things do exist in other spaces too. So again, we can't be too universalizing about this kind of argument. I mean, I discovered, to my surprise actually, going into a pretty major museum in Australia, which has a huge thoroughfare of the public. It's basically, you can walk off the street or out of the parklands and just into this space. And if you do one thing that seems mildly antisocial, like just clap, which most composers and sound artists like to do in a space to test the acoustics, the security guards will come down on you like nothing else. There's things you just can't do unless you've been legislated by the custodians, the curators, or the security staff. But it is true that there's less things you can do in a concert hall, I suppose. I mean, supercritical mass, just to rest on that project for a moment, I mean, that was partly built as a total resistance to that kind of one-way power dynamic. I've been to concerts at Carnegie Hall here in New York where, I mean, I'm 6'2". I'm not especially tall, but I'm taller than average. And I find it really difficult to be jammed in right in the center of a long row of chairs for a 2-hour concert. I just have to occasionally move my legs, or, I'll start to really lose feeling in them. You start doing that just a few times in a piece of music that's 20 minutes long, and you just get glares, you get someone who's going to tell you off afterwards. You're breaking this total social code, and you're also breaking this idea that you have agency. I these days almost can't stop thinking about concerts in the classical tradition as almost being a weird form of BDSM. Like, you're sort of putting yourself in such a position of subservience that all of the heavy weight, not only of culture and history, but just of architecture and social dynamics, is such that you just can't do anything but the narrowest of cultural responses. Clap at the right time, walk out at halftime but never before. There's literally so little you can do except absorb the beauty and the majesty of this music. Luckily, the music is really good, so you can have that experience, but that's a very limited way of responding to something.
You mean physically?
Well, just that, you're not ever going to really change a Mahler symphony. You're not even going to have the opportunity to go and listen from different parts of the room. You can't talk back to it. It can only talk to you. So luckily, there is a great deal of depth and, majesty and controlled built kind of meaning that another artist from another time has done for you. Has done a lot of work so you can get this very rich, powerful experience. But I just resist the idea that I have to be locked down in a chair and have to hear it from beginning to end, because that's the cultural dynamic we've set up.
That's true. And Mala tends to be very lengthy, so if you want to stretch your legs, you really don't get the chance to do that.
Best to detach your legs, go into the seat, and then reattach them after the concert.
Well, I suppose that's what supercritical mass also does, that you're pulling it out of the space physically. So you're exploring... Actually, I listened to one of your interviews and you said you were exploring the sonic, the spatial, and the social all in the one.
Yeah, I mean, look, any ensemble actually does that too. I mean, an orchestra explores those three things. It explores the spatial by playing in a concert hall, it explores the sonic by playing an orchestra, and explores the social by having a group of people play to another group of people, the orchestra versus listener. But supercritical mass was just an attempt to rethink what the benefits are of these large groups of people coming together and how it might be rethought moving forward. So all of the frustrations I have with the orchestra are pretty much everything that a traditional orchestra does. For one thing, there's a huge sense of hierarchy. There is a top-down approach. The composer, in some people's minds, is at the top of the pyramid. I think that maybe the orchestra CEO is probably at the top of the pyramid, followed by the conductor. Sometimes the composer's way down below the back desk of the violins. I mean, in terms of power, that is. But it's a huge triangle, and even like the sections of the orchestra conform to that. So it's very top down. It's very rigid spatially. I mean, not only the arrangement of musicians on stage, but the fact that you have a stage, an elevated space that really doesn't change. You have the occasional orchestra that likes to do a pop-up ad where they're going to appear in a mall or on a bus or something as a kind of like a cute social media tactic, but they really don't like playing outside of concert halls, I think. There's also a great sense of linearity. The piece starts, ends, and that's it. There's all of those points are things that I wanted to invert. So supercritical mass brings a large group of people together. It's very, very open as to who can participate. Pretty much anyone can participate if you have the time and inclination. Because even over time, we've shifted from requiring people to play a kind of musical instrument to really just being able to make any kind of sound. The space is very open and porous, and it tends to be a space that is one that, like we mentioned before, is a civic space that has a lot of mobility in it already, like a public arena or a town hall or a town square. But it's built into the piece and the ensemble intrinsically. The piece and the group of people have to relate to that space acoustically, socially, historically, and culturally. There is a really reduced sense of hierarchy. So everyone's effectively doing the same action collectively, but with their own sense of nuance, their own sense of body architecture, their own response, and their own real-time response against the other people and the place. It's very ephemeral. It's also not particularly heterogeneous. Like the orchestra has all these different types of sounds and instruments, and the supercritical mass ensembles tend to have one type of sound at a time. But it basically does everything upside down and tries to present this much more porous, kind of embedded, spatially aware, utopic way of bringing people together in an ensemble that is inclusive and generative and full of back and forth power dynamics between listener, performer, composer, commissioner. Everyone's kind of on the same level, really, even to the point where I don't usually like even putting my name to the pieces. It's part of the project, which is inherently a collaboration with all the people involved in it. So yeah, it's just a little utopic way forward, perhaps, that has had a bit of a life over the last dozen years or so.
It's really amazing. And you started it in, was it 2007 when that first started?
Yeah, so Janet McKay and I came up with the concept in 2007, started shopping it around, and within a year we got a commission to do a piece at Carriage Works in Sydney, which had really just kind of opened at that stage. And so here was a great test case. Janet, who is an incredible flautist, knew a huge number of flute players in Sydney, and we were able to corral about 80 of them to run a few workshops and to basically come up with some very simple instruction-based scores to find a way to engage spatially with this incredibly rich post-industrial space. I mean, if you've not been to Carriage Works, I mean, the ceilings are at least 8 meters high. The main foyer space is about 80 meters long. It creates a hugely rich ambient sound. We had about 400, 500, 600 people turn up to the event, so suddenly there was this incredible integration between listener and performer, sometimes to the point where you didn't quite know who was who, except that the performers were the ones with the flutes. And yeah, it's been going strong ever since. I should also just quickly note that there were precedents, not only broadly culturally to this, it's not a particularly original concept, but precedents close to me. I will name Damien Barbler as a starter for this idea. He came up with a very similar concept about 5 years earlier, a project that I was involved in, where it was also algorithmically behavioral-based ensemble making with very simple objects. And he'd also come up with some other really conceptually striking ways even years earlier than that. So there's kind of like a continuation. This just happens to formalize some of these things into a project shape.
So since then, you've obviously been commissioned for several things, also internationally. I thought we'd actually focus on one of the pieces, which has been written about a lot and it happened when I was at university in 2017, the 24-hour choir. I thought that would be an interesting one to unpack, how that became an idea and how the process of actually performing that occurred.
Yeah, so the early years of Supercritical Mass were much more focused on instruments for some reason. I guess, Janet's a flute player, so that made sense. But we did like orchestras of flutes, orchestras of brass instruments, orchestras of clarinets. We found an amazing, rich repository of beautifully tuned handbells, the Federation handbells in Melbourne. So that was another way of kind of getting a larger group of people together. We started to realize quickly that just limiting it to musical instruments started to counteract the more inclusive purpose of the project. Because after all, even though the flute at its cheapest end of the cost spectrum is pretty accessible for people, I mean, you can kind of pick up one for a couple $100, the idea of having time, resources, space, and even access to lessons even suddenly starts to narrow in the level of participation to a certain class of person. So we wanted to find a way that anyone who had the time and inclination to be involved in this could partake. And the human voice became one of the obvious mechanisms for that. Now, a number of other really significant artists decades earlier have done work in this vein. Pauline Oliveros is one really striking precedent. Cornelius Cardew is another person who, both of them using voice as a way to kind of think collectively in works from the 60s and 70s. And I guess the whole choir model is also one of this, like particularly the broader community choir model where you just kind of turn up and make songs together each week, and it's an incredibly socially enriching way to operate with your peers. So 24-hour choir was just a simple prompt of how to do a collective breath across a bizarrely long amount of time, in this case, a 24-hour cycle. What would that mean? I mean, one person can't just sing notes without a break across that amount of time. You need at least one other person who will help share the load. So suddenly this kind of ethics of sharing and duty to others comes into being. Ideally, you have more than two people. You might have 3, 4, 40, 400, however many choose to participate. And I think across the 24-hour cycle, we had about 150 people join in. The setting was a really powerful place in Sydney, which is right at kind of the apex of the rocks. There is a park called Observation Hill, Observation Park. It's right next to the old observatory. And significantly, you're also surrounded by buildings which for many decades prior to this piece in 2017 had been allocated as social housing. I mean, there's a really long, rich history of the rocks that of course go back to Aboriginal people in the area, and then a sequence of other sort of forms of society, from sailors through to the social housing days of the 20th century. Significantly, at the time that this piece happened, those people were basically being booted out and forced off to the outskirts of the city, and what had kind of become this space of the most disenfranchised was becoming a space of privatization. And so we wanted to not only do this kind of abstract form of social sonic building across the time, but also to find a way that those who were departing could potentially partake. There was no need for anyone to learn any words, learn any tune. You just had to kind of, find a way to collectively solve the problem of keeping this sound going. And to my great delight, some members of those houses who were on their way out were able to participate. It kind of became a kind of a little like wordless requiem almost for the rocks changing beyond all recognition. It also became this study into how humans relate to the environment, because over the course of a 24-hour cycle, you get every shade possible of ambient sound. You get the thick, hot air of the late afternoon where all the sounds close to you are really meaningful, the sounds of birds and trees, the traffic beside you. You get the cold, cool air at 3 a.m. that means sounds from the distant horizon across the water will come to be very real. The sound travels in a different way. And we had everything from 2 people, me and one other person, at 3 a.m., through to at least 30 or 40 at any one time. So it became this really interesting study into how sound relates to its environment. And just finally, it also became a really powerful means of me giving up any last vestige of control, because virtually no one really followed the instructions that I had very carefully designed for it that would make the process easy. I mean, it was with the spirit of generosity in mind, but almost everyone just came and went, okay, yep, I'll find a way to make the sound keep going. And after about 12 hours of continuously singing, I kind of gave up feeling frustrated and just went, you know what? These other people are sharing in the responsibility of making this work. I can rely upon and give over to peers. There's no sense that I have to be the author of this piece. So that was a really profound shift for me as an artist, to delegate shared responsibility for things to those who are also involved.
So then you're trying out or kind of exploring a new model in which the process itself is the performance and the experience of the piece.
Yeah, and whilst there were a few workshops prior to this where we drafted up some ideas and maybe 20 or 30 people met at various times in the lead up to this, pretty much you could turn up at any point in the 24-hour cycle and join in. You just had to step into this little rotunda on the hill, which gave you a bit of shelter from rain and not much shelter from cold or hot air, but it kind of also provided a little focal point for the performers. And once you stepped into that rotunda, then you were just tasked with, okay, you have to somehow keep this going. There was kind of like a contraction of rehearsal and performance and composition all in one. I really liked that. It wasn't so much a theatrical thing that you practice and then present the final product. The product is the process and vice versa.
Do you think this could be a potential method of producing new music or new art for the future?
Definitely for me. I mean, there's a long history of this kind of revealing the back end as part of art, particularly more within the contemporary art museum kind of world. But definitely for me, it really started to see me say goodbye to the idea that I have to rehearse. I mean, surely, there's something valuable about rehearsing because you're basically saying, I'm going to do the work involved to give you a certain kind of experience. So I'm going to basically put myself at your disposal in a certain way. But I think there's something really beautifully transparent about saying that, every point in an artistic process is open to negotiation. It's a social process. It's one that's open to influence of all the different factors around. And so there's no kind of before, during, and after. It's all interaction and social production. And so I just like that all the best you're doing in this is basically starting and ending that point of social production. It's never saying that there's bits you can't see, and definitely not saying that once the musicians stop playing and walk off stage, they've had their applause and they go backstage, that suddenly the art is over. So it's kind of really trying to make art just an everyday social process, which has obviously long histories, but this is my way of doing it.
Well, when you talk about the musicians kind of packing their instruments up and doing that bow and then walking in a horde off the two sides of the stage, well, when you go and book a concert, they tend to have 3 or 4 nights where they play the same repertoire or the same set list for that concert. Whereas in this case, with the 24-hour choir, it happens once. So it's this kind of temporary, large scale, but temporary experience in a public space. Is there a reason why they don't tend to have repeated performances, some of the works within supercritical mass?
Yeah, there's probably a few answers to that question, none of them especially compelling to recount, except that, I mean, maybe in a way it falls a bit into the logic of the museum and of the contemporary art market in a way where exclusivity and one-offs are actually the way that you make value. And that's actually the opposite of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make it that experiencing something right here and now where you are absolutely needing to factor in everything that's happening. So it's a kind of a risky, kind of vulnerable and provisional way of being that has no kind of set outcome in a way. I think that is a really powerful way to engage with the world right now. But it's certainly not about like you're there, and if you're not there, you miss it, and therefore you missed out because you didn't have a chance to get along. A lot of the works are reproducible, and one example is a piece that was designed not for a very, very specific place, but a type of place. So it was a work that the Museum of Contemporary Art Australia commissioned in conjunction with Performance Space in Sydney, and we made a work that is basically for all the people collected in a contemporary art museum, which typically has a lot of different types of artwork on different walls and in different spaces. And it's basically, if you want to come and learn the process ahead of time, you can basically then walk through the building dressed as you normally would, doing the art as you normally would, looking at that painting, standing and observing that sculpture, having a little chat to your neighbor. But you've just got a certain set of behaviors involving the voice that kind of shift the social atmosphere somewhat. So I've given you a few things to memorize, like if you're this far away from an artwork, if you're going to sing a note, it's going to be a lower note or a higher note. if someone joins you who's part of the process, you'll start to synchronize the voice. If 3 of you join, then you're going to do another kind of synchronizing, but a different sort of vocalization that's not so much humming, but more an open voice. These are very simple parameters. It's just a way of like sonically articulating this kind of way that we collectively inhabit a museum. The point of this story is that we did that in 2014. It was quite successful. The museum actually bought it, which is a whole long story in itself. The fact that they would buy a score, an action, as opposed to something to put on the wall was interesting and very worthwhile of them, I thought. But we redid it again in 2016 once they'd acquired it, and the piece worked just as well with 50 other people that weren't part of the first one. And then another museum, Shepparton Art Museum, borrowed the work to do it in 2017, about a month after the 24-hour choir. And again, it worked really well with a different set of people in a different location. So that's an example where there's the internal dynamics of the composition, and then the instructions are kind of, to be really aware of the environment you're in, but it doesn't depend on the fact that there's 4 contemporary art museum rooms versus 10, or that it's indoors or outdoors. But I guess I just really want to always ensure that there is definitely an indexation to the immediate environment, because you're actually paying attention to all of the factors involved. It's not this kind of abstracted concept of the stage. It's that there is no stage. The stage is just the domain that you happen to be in.
So would you say that these particular performances or works are more accessible being in spaces like contemporary art galleries or libraries or town halls?
Well, kind of, because they are particularly public spaces. But, I mean, a museum has its own set of, politics and sets of inclusions and exclusions. I long ago realized you can't just, from the outside, go to a museum and assume that it's like a utopian space. It's subject to the same power dynamics as any other kind of space. But it's true that I do tend towards spaces that are designed specifically for mobility and interaction of some kind or other. And so in that sense, yes, they're kind of more accessible than if you had to buy a ticket for a very locked off, very acoustically specific space like a concert hall. But I guess, part of the realization of the project is that nowhere is free of power dynamics. It's just that they might have a wider degree of permissibility or a lesser degree. And I try to go with socially rich, assembly rich spaces as opposed to ones that are really strictly codified like concert halls or theatres.
Exactly. And like you mentioned before, there's a financial aspect that's related to being able to run a concert hall that's a bit different than an art gallery, in that they need to fill seats to some degree in order to make it viable.
Yeah, I mean, they're both very expensive cultural spaces. I mean, the cost of maintaining a museum, even just, keeping the air at the right temperature, guarding precious works, I mean, then neither are particularly cheap spaces to run. But yeah, there is something about the kind of critical mass of ticket sales that is a factor in all of this. I mean, I guess the point of accessibility is partly for the listener in these projects, but it's also partly just positioning the listener as someone who can actively partake in a certain degree of decision making, even if it's just on the simple level of I can come in and listen to a bit of this and then choose to go away. Like if it's happening in King George Square in Brisbane, in a sense, if I and my peers have decided to do an event there, then you are sort of co-opted into having to experience 50 people playing bells. So, still sort of like having to kind of capture you a little bit, but you can choose to not be in that space and just go away or come back in 10 minutes when the piece is stopped. You can't really quite do that as easily in a concert hall. So it's always about not only giving the listener agency, but also the idea that we really couldn't reconceive of these cultural vehicles like orchestras as being people-led. So, in every supercritical mass work, there's not this sense that I've gone away and thought about this meta concept that you then have to perform. It's almost always a series of workshops, or at least a workshop or an open workshop if the piece is the workshop, where I want to listen to what everyone who's turned up is capable of doing. I want to learn about what their tendencies are and what they're enjoying. I want to then prod that a little and push it and then rethink it so that there's a certain progression that we're all kind of like moving into some different space together. We're having a sort of a shift in our perspectives, but it's really led by what people can and can't do to begin with. So there's never a wrong way of doing any of these pieces. It's totally built on the collective possibilities of that group. And you just don't get that in an orchestra. You have to have trained from age whatever, 0. You have to have had the right kind of resources at your disposal, whether it's a very expensive instrument, lessons, the right kind of space, parents who cared enough to help you into that space in the first place. And then there's still a gazillion other barriers of entry. I mean, if you think about how many orchestral musicians there are in Australia, there's, some hundreds. I guess it's somewhere between 500 and 1,000 musicians. How many music students are there in conservatoriums alone? I mean, there's a tiniest proportion of possibility that you'll get into one of these things in the first place. They are not inclusive spaces. And so I want to open up a much more inclusive space where we can do a version of collectivity that is not determined by your position in society, certainly not your economic position.
Do you think because of the model you've adopted in terms of thinking about these projects and I use the word program loosely, but programming them for the public, you've had more diverse participation and thus access and more diverse an audience comparatively to, say, we keep talking about orchestras, so comparative to an orchestra?
I'd like to think so. For one thing, the performances are almost invariably free. So, there's no particular economic disincentive to come along. I think that there is a bit of an illusion, though, in terms of the diversity of who participates, and it's just an inbuilt problem that has to just keep being thought about, which is that no one's ever charged to be part of it. No one ever really gets paid to be part of it either. But there's a certain kind of politics of access for who has the time and the means to actually volunteer and be part of one of these things. So I open it up as an opportunity to do something collectively, but there's still only a certain subsection of the populace who can take a day out to come and be part of it. There's childcare, there is the need to earn a living, there's just time on your hands. So I guess, you do tend to see a pretty wide variety of faces and bodies in these things, but there's almost always a hidden economic underpinning, which is that, busy, overworked parents are rarely going to come along if they can't also bring their kids. There's a bit of an over preponderance of music and art students who just tend to want to get out and do something participatory because they have a bit more time on their hands, and then a fairly solid sort of senior level of participation of, again, people who may typically have a bit more ability to turn up. So I don't really know the answer of that. So I've got a lot of performance theory and participation theory books always coming to my door in this period of lockdown, so I can keep thinking about these problems, and just to at least do something to try to open up the degree of openness to cultural meaning making together.
What I also like is that it doesn't sit in any category, that it's not visual art, it's not necessarily just performing art, it's not classical music. You've kind of created a series of communities around the world through the process of performing these pieces and somewhat rehearsing them.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. The core concepts behind this kind of way of working are not particularly discipline specific, but I think that that's probably something I try to keep adding to music in general, which is getting there. But traditionally, music has kind of locked itself off a little bit from the rest of the world. And certain thinkers will aggressively tell you that, like a theorist like Seth Kim Cohen, for instance, who's a pretty major deal in the sound studies world, has a long-standing argument that music lags behind the more plastic or visual arts because the contemporary art realm and modernism has had a century of the likes of Marcel Duchamp and conceptualists who've really tried to really deeply integrate conceptual and contextual and societal and political ways of thinking into art practice. And music's kind of maybe not done the best job of that. Hence, we still have orchestras that don't allow anyone in. I guess that's just what I'm trying to, in my very small way, keep contributing to music as a conversation, that there are ways of thinking about it that are about power dynamics, that are about cultural forces, and the way that the act of making sound is in itself a political act. And that we really need to keep turning that critical lens back on the power structures that we adopt as our emblems, because the orchestra is an emblem of what we value socially in Australia, for instance, because orchestras collectively get the biggest slice of money. I love orchestras and I would love for them to retain the money, and I just think we should just add on to that money all of the other things that are equally deserving of support. But the fact that we're kind of, at the moment at least, weighing, we're sort of valuing the input and the life of a violinist who's not particularly tethered to making contemporary music, like making the music of now in Australia. We're basically saying that we value them enough to have superannuation, a wage, a living costs covered, but we're not going to do that to anyone who wants to, not play a violin and not be in an orchestra that wasn't even going to accept them in the first place. So being critical, I think, is really valuable as the first step to being a much more responsive musical landscape.
Do you think this covers the entire industry as a whole? Because when you're starting out, say like as a young musician or a young composer, you're going to be a freelance musician. And often when that happens, there's already the finances are kind of stacked against you. There's this public perception, even within our industry, working with older musicians, that you can just work for exposure and you don't deserve any financial support. Moving it all the way up to big MPAs in Australia that get most of the public funding. Then do they then carry the responsibility, because of the financing that they have access to, the responsibility to program new music and engage with more diverse practitioners?
I think that they do. I think that any organisation that is given a large amount of public funds has to be entirely accountable to its constituents. And I feel like it's just bizarre, but like orchestras and opera companies that do get the biggest slice of the pie by far seem to be the least responsive and the least accountable to its constituents. I mean, you could say that they're accountable in terms of, at least a third of the budgets for these companies comes from ticket sales. So they're being responsive to what people apparently want to listen to. But there's such murkiness around who gets commissioned to do things. That's the case with museums and galleries as well. There's almost zero accountability there. I just think that if you're going to be given the task of representing a culture pretty much by proxy, because you're just given so much money to do so, then you have a duty to be responsive to what living practitioners are doing now and what is meaning right now in Australia and moving into the future. And if the meaning is going to be how we judge ourselves against Mahler or Beethoven, fair enough, it's fine to go and listen to that. But like, why is that 99% of what we're supporting? So yes, I definitely think that they definitely need to be much more diverse, for sure, and just much more lithe and accountable to what our culture wants at any one time. And that's why when I think of the orchestra, it's no enemy to me. I love orchestras. The idea of coming together collectively to make sound together, to me, is the driving principle. And so that's why I'm trying to implement some other models in my own small way, and why I think that we need to keep investing in a huge multiplicity of alternative models, and that we always need to keep valuing people's contribution to meaning making culturally by giving them some money.
I suppose coming out of all of this and working with supercritical mass, it's given you a lot to think about in terms of thinking about the world of orchestra and how it was and still remains a symbol of our industry.
Yeah, I've given this some thought, and I actually wrote a book chapter about this quite recently, which was looking at a supercritical mass event back in 2013 in Birmingham, which was a commission to help open this really grand new public space to sort of say, look, we value coming together as a civic hub. And so myself, Janet McKay, Luke Yanister, as part of supercritical mass, we were seen as useful to help fill in that conversation by bringing together like 100 brass players from throughout Birmingham and the surrounds. So we did this sort of hour-long immersive composition through this really dramatic new building. The musicians would be on circular gantries and tiers. The public, of which there were maybe 3,000 or 4,000 coming through across the day, could ascend through travelators and then hear these different tiers of brass musicians, notably not playing from a score, but really just listening to each other and kind of call and response, and thinking through some basic blocking, like you're going to start out by treating the instrument as an object. You're going to be tapping, you're going to be blowing against it, you're going to be taking the mouthpiece out of your French horn. You're going to kind of go from this general consensus of noise and objects through to slowly coming into a form of harmonic consensus towards the middle before spooling out again into a sense of individuation. So you kind of get this sense of noise comes to chord, comes to everyone kind of doing whatever they like sort of thing. But it sort of occurred to me that you could think of libraries and orchestras in similar ways. They're both kind of spaces of possibility, these utopian spaces of possibility, but they're also traditionally and culturally these spaces of archiving and repository. And I think they fulfill both functions pretty well. I mean, you can go to a library and there's maybe decades, if not hundreds, if not thousands of years of scholarship that you can access at the turn of a mousepad or at the reach of a book. And similarly with an orchestra, they're sort of there to maintain a certain body of repertoire that's there for you. But also, maybe on the more generative side, they're spaces of assembly for multiplicity. And in a library, it's notable that these days you don't have to go to a library to read a book. You can go to the library to access the Wi-Fi. You can go there to discreetly drink a drink and have lunch. You can go there as someone who has no home and again discreetly pull a hat over your eyes and kind of nod off. They're kind of safe collective spaces that allow for a lot of different things to happen so long as it's quiet. And you could argue that the orchestra could be doing that, but it kind of doesn't. It kind of only really does the memory building part of it, the collectivizing and the archiving. I think it's really important with orchestras in particular to not only think of them as spaces of possibility, but to also acknowledge that they come out of a very specific time and place. I mean, they come out of a time in history where for some centuries, Europe was trying to dominate the planet and did so pretty well. I mean, it colonized most of the planet, if you combine the efforts of France and England and Portugal and Spain, etc. I personally see the orchestra as working in lockstep with that kind of colonization of the planet. I see it as a very militaristic kind of way of operating. If you think of the power that the States has had in recent decades, I see that in a sort of a triune fashion. You've got the militaristic force, you've got the economic force, and you've got the cultural force. And I think the orchestra, from a European perspective, sort of fits into that model as well. It's an economic force. You can only have an orchestra if you have enough wealth to support it. And so it's kind of like a PR strategy for your country's wealth. You can only do it it's a kind of a soft diplomacy as well. It's kind of the marker of a certain degree of sophistication, of learning, of education, of having a history worth sharing. In a sort of a dark sense of the term. And it's also a kind of a military squadron. I mean, it is a very finely tuned instrument of collectivity that is driven by a commander. It has a conductor, it has a chief, and everyone fulfills their role. So I can't divorce that from the reality of the fact that we've in the last century kind of come out of some centuries of European domination. And I think it's notable that when Europe started to lose its place in the world, the orchestra stopped evolving, effectively. I mean, it stopped evolving around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, right at the time when Europe itself stopped having the same kind of meaning in the world. And then you start to see orchestras pop up in other parts of the world that want to assume a new form of empire building, like the States, for instance. So I sort of can't really not think of the orchestra as being deeply symbolic of power. And it does this kind of sleight of hand by kind of making you see that appreciating orchestral music is just for its universal, true values of beautiful, complex thought. But I just don't want to divorce it from the systems of power that brought it into being in the first place. And particularly in a country like Australia, I mean, if we're going to do these collective models of power and display of wealth and education, why is it with a European model? Why is it not with other models that actually show what Australia in all of its useful and interesting flux and diversity is? There's some potted thoughts that I've been thinking about lately about orchestras.
I mean, you've touched on so many things I've been trying to think about but haven't properly articulated them. But you've done that in a much better way. So the first thing you mentioned that I want to touch on is hierarchy. And I always look into an orchestra and think it's really weird how they're so highly regimented, as you say, because what it is a group of highly trained 90, 120 to maybe 140 creative people who are all forced to play the same thing in the same structure. And for those who don't know what it looks like behind the scenes for an orchestra, it's really proper scheduled hours. You know, you're scheduled to do X amount of concerts a week and then X amount of rehearsals a week that accomplish being able to play that music for those concerts scheduled for that week at a certain standard. And then every week it's like this over and over again. So you have these highly creative people who are sort of squished into a very formulaic existence in terms of creating art.
It's kind of like boot camp. And the only difference between an orchestra and the military is that I think the military is a little bit more inclusive as to who can join. Probably a lot more inclusive because they definitely need the numbers. I think of orchestras these days a little bit like on ABC TV. I don't know if it's still the case because I haven't really watched it here in the States. But like once a year at least, they would broadcast the Edinburgh Tattoo. And you'd see this kind of display of Scottish people with the Scottish hats and the Scottish kilts and the bagpipes and the brass doing a sort of a display of effectively impotent power. Like what is a pipe and drum band for in terms of like, it's just a display of power, especially from a part of the world, the UK, that is pretty impotent in terms of its role in the world these days. So I sort of think that, I don't think you have to think too far outside the square to see the occasional orchestra broadcast in the same way. It's this kind of show of strength in a very beautiful way. I mean, again, I'm not questioning the quality of the music, the value of the musicians, and just the actual literal experience of hearing one of these things. It's incredible. It's unmissable. You've got to hear an orchestra at least once in your life. But in terms of the kind of the formation, the squadron-like nature of it, the militaristic kind of precision, and the fact that, only the fittest survive, it really is the fittest survive in the orchestral world. And it's not even the fittest, because you can't really be the fittest. You've also got to have come from the right background. You've got to have the right amount of wealth. They're really ruthless machines. And I think that we just ought to be realistic about what the orchestra is, enjoy it, appreciate it, continue it, support it, but also like not be rosy-eyed about what this thing is culturally, especially in a country like Australia.
And I've never thought of like the orchestra being live archiving in terms of performing the archives. It's really interesting because what you mentioned about Europe's declining power coinciding with this cycle of repertoire around, I'd say, early 20th century in terms of imperialism, but in France it really didn't happen until the 70s and 80s. But it is coinciding with orchestras playing the same rotation of repertoire to the point where you go to countries that are not European, so Australia, America, South America, and even huge parts of Asia, we're still playing the same repertoire. So this exact model of this European styled pure or absolute truth of what music is kind of being repeated and replicated all around the world. It's not just Europe anymore.
It's kind of like the common era stops when Europe stops becoming the commonplace. We stopped really taking the music seriously after about 1915-ish. I mean, there are obviously pieces in the repertoire since then, but the majority of it is from the time of European empire. It's the voice, the mouthpiece of that.
Well, as we move away from the early 1900s, and although there's seemingly a system of replicating this archive of orchestral repertoire, the world of sound art and experimenting and ensembles have begun to move differently in various ways out of this. And in a way, you mentioned Pauline Oliveros, and I feel like I should touch on her because I remember reading a lot of her work when I was doing my own research towards the tail end of studying at the Conservatorium, and all of the publication, I forgot what it's called now, Sonic Meditations. They're all about listening deeply and listening as activism. And what I liked about the way she writes is that she promotes this idea of listening deeply, not just for musicians, even though she's a highly skilled musician herself, but it was also for the public. So this text is accessible, and some of the written exercises can be accessed by anybody in a way, the same way that you've kind of done the same thing in terms of the participation.
Yeah, there's very little barriers of entry to the Sonic Meditations. I mean, first of all, you can download them off the web for free if you do the right Google search. But they're very inclusive. I mean, they're just basically short paragraphs of information that are really designed for how to think through being a literal society. And that society is just whoever's going to turn up and want to do a Sonic Meditation. They're really beautiful and poetic. And I think it's been so vindicating and rewarding to see the level of attention that has been given to Pauline Oliveros in recent years. Sadly, she's no longer with us to partake in this long overdue attention to her work, but she's really one of the more powerful figures in recent memory in experimental and contemporary music in so many ways. A powerful individual artist, performer, pioneer in so many different ways, and also a very, very generous person. I remember she emailed me once or twice saying, and she never really met me. I got to interview her for radio, but it was only via, the anonymity of two studios in two parts of the world, a bit like what we're doing right now. So she wouldn't know me from anyone else. But, she said in emails like, you should come up and say hi, come up to meet me upstate New York sometime. She scheduled a piece of mine to open one of her long-form festivals once. And I'm just one of thousands of people she crossed paths with in any given year. She's really kind of like, she's certainly one of my heroes. And I've taken a lot from my studies of her work to somewhat transmogrify into some of my own practices.
You know what would be really cool, and I was thinking about this when I first came across her work, is if those sonic meditations became part of studying in a very traditional institution like a conservatorium, because it really does open your mind up to what you can do as a performer or a creator and how you can connect between each other in an ensemble, but also, like you said at the beginning, making the ensemble about your audience as well.
Yeah, and it's kind of introducing almost like a theatre sports / get to know you exercise / philosophical conundrum into the act of playing music together. I mean, I would be very surprised and disheartened if the sonic meditations aren't really central to a lot of music pedagogy these days. It probably isn't. Recently I think it was about a month or so into the COVID lockdown worldwide, there was a reversioning of a Pauline Oliveros work, Pink Moon, which some hundreds of people across the world were able to participate in just by plugging into Zoom. That was a really rich way to come together in a moment of, terror and strife globally. And there was no real major instruction. They're very inclusive, the pieces along those lines. So I think she's an excellent starting point for anyone thinking critically and empathetically about music making.
I think you and I could probably keep talking about this music making for ages, from the nuance of the orchestra all the way through everything Supercritical Mass has been doing. But I have to ask, is there anything we should all be keeping our ears peeled for over the next year or so?
Yes, so I'm really just continuing to spread my wings in terms of being an artist and a composer. I have work that I'm preparing right now for the Brisbane Festival in September 2020 with the Institute of Modern Art in Brisbane. I'm looking forward to 2021 in terms of hopefully being able to return to Australia and keep making Supercritical Mass works, but also hopefully and ideally continuing my video practice, my scoring practice, sculptural installation practice. There's been a big shift for me in terms of like coming to terms with the fact that for 20 years of my life I've been a radio presenter, and yet I've been making these fairly kind of open-ended structures in my artwork without any real reference to the fact that I have a speaking voice. So I've actually been doing a lot of sort of solipsistic soul-searching and writing about things from a sort of more positioned perspective, and so I think that's going to come through a bit more in the work. But I've also had a couple of commissions from the Australian Music Centre and from Tura in Perth, and there'll be new video and sound works coming out in the not-too-distant future. So don't forget to log on to julianday.com and you'll find out more.
Oh my goodness, you're so busy. It's really amazing that you've somehow managed to balance all these components of your career together simultaneously. I just wanted to say thank you so much for talking with me and sharing all your ideas with us, particularly about the process of your work and how you think about it, and also the nuances of the orchestra that maybe we should consider thinking about.
It's been an absolute delight to speak with you and to have the opportunity to speak and to share some ideas, and I think this series is amazing. I'm looking forward to hearing every episode in your podcast series. It's a great initiative.
Thanks, Julian, and thanks again for being on the show. I know that I'll be keeping my ears and my eyes peeled for everything you have coming up, and I'm sure our audience is as well. For anybody out there who's interested in following up on Julian's work, all the links and the details relating to his upcoming projects, published papers, and the powerhouse that is Supercritical Mass is available in the description and the transcript. You know what I'll also do, as we talked about Pauline Oliveros quite a lot, I'll pop a link so all of you might download Pauline's sonic meditations and get to know her work more closely if you haven't had the chance yet. Wow, I think we've covered a lot this episode. Once again, thank you to Julian, and thank you all for listening. Catch you next time.